Leonatus, a battle-worn soldier, trudged through the vast, snow-covered fields that stretched endlessly before him. Each step was a battle in itself, his legs heavy with fatigue, his body battered by the bitter winds that howled across the desolate landscape. His worn boots, caked with ice and mud, sank deep into the snow, leaving a trail of slow, determined footsteps behind him. His breath, ragged and visible in the cold night air, was labored from the many years he had spent on the battlefield, fighting a war that had torn his homeland apart. His once proud uniform, now tattered and faded, barely shielded him from the elements. But despite the cold that gnawed at his bones, a flicker of warmth burned within him. His heart, though scarred by the horrors of war, was filled with a glimmer of hope. A hope born from the thought of home. The years of relentless fighting had left him with more than just physical wounds. The faces of fallen comrades haunted his dreams, and the deafening sound of clashing steel and gunfire echoed in his mind. Yet, in the midst of all this, it was the thought of home, the village nestled in the hills, his family waiting by the hearth, that kept him going. As he pressed on, his thoughts wandered to memories that had sustained him during the darkest moments of battle. He could almost hear his mother's gentle voice calling his name, a sound that had always brought him comfort as a child. Her voice, tender and full of love, was a beacon guiding him through the storm of emotions that raged inside him. His father's laughter, deep and hearty, echoed in his ears like the sound of a distant yet cherished melody. Leonatus could picture his father sitting by the fire, regaling friends and neighbors with stories of his youth, his eyes crinkling with joy as he recounted the tales. These memories were his refuge, the one thing that the war could not take from him. They were the reason he kept pushing forward, despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. With every step closer to home, he felt the weight of the war lifting, though the scars it had left upon his soul would never fully heal. The wind picked up, swirling snowflakes around him in a chaotic dance, but even the icy gusts could not extinguish the warmth he felt inside. He knew that somewhere ahead, beyond the hills and through the forest, his village awaited him. The village he had not seen in years, the place where he had grown up, where he had said his goodbyes before leaving for a war that had seemed unending. In the distance, faint and barely perceptible, the dim lights of his village began to twinkle against the darkened sky. They were like stars scattered across the horizon, drawing him closer with each step. Though the journey had been long, and the years had taken their toll, the thought of reuniting with his family, of sitting by the fire, hearing the sounds of Christmas once again, filled him with a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. He was tired, but he was almost there. Almost home. The moon hung high in the winter sky, its pale, silvery light spilling across the snow-covered ground like a celestial guide. It illuminated the path before Leonatus, casting long shadows from the towering pine trees that flanked the narrow road leading to the village. The crunch of snow beneath his boots was the only sound in the December night, save for the faint whistle of the wind weaving through the branches. The cold bit at his skin, a sharp, persistent reminder of the unforgiving winter. But the moonlight offered him comfort, as if it, too, was leading him home. Each step Leonatus took brought him closer to the village he had once called home, and with every step, his emotions swirled into a mixture of joy and fear. His heart leapt at the thought of the reunion that awaited him, the embrace of his parents, the warmth of familiar faces, the long-lost comfort of a place where he belonged. Yet, just as powerful was the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. Would the village be as he remembered? Would his family still be there, waiting for him? Or had time, like the relentless passing of seasons, changed everything beyond recognition? He couldn't help but wonder what he might find. War had taken so much from him. What if it had taken his home, too? What if the faces he longed to see had vanished like so many others, swept away by the winds of time and conflict? His heart, though eager, was burdened by these unanswerable questions, and his footsteps, though steady, carried the weight of uncertainty. The night was bitterly cold, each breath he exhaled turning to frost in the air before him. The chill seeped into his bones, but Leonatus hardly noticed it anymore. The cold had become a familiar companion during his long journey, and he had learned to endure it. What kept him moving now, what shielded him from the biting wind, was the memory of home and the promise of Christmas. As he walked, he heard the distant chime of church bells ringing out into the stillness, their soft, reverberating notes marking the midnight hour. Christmas Eve. The realization struck him with a wave of nostalgia. Christmas, the season of warmth and light, of family and joy. It had been years since he had experienced the holiday in the embrace of his loved ones, surrounded by laughter and love. The bells were a reminder not only of the passing time, but of the timeless traditions that had once been part of his life. The thought filled him with a deep yearning to be home, to sit by the fire with his parents, to hear the sound of familiar voices, to feel, even for a moment, the peace that Christmas promised. As he rounded a bend in the road, the outline of the village came into view. The sight of it, though faint and shrouded by the night, filled Leonatus with an overwhelming sense of relief. He could see the soft glow of candlelight flickering through the windows of the small houses, and smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, rising into the cold, star-filled sky. The familiar scent of pine and burning wood carried on the breeze, mingling with the crispness of the snow, and it was as though the very air whispered of home. He paused for a moment, his breath catching in his throat, taking it all in. The village, the lights, the smoke. It was all so familiar, yet tinged with the uncertainty that had haunted him since he began his journey back. But the sight of it stirred something deep within him, a sense of belonging that had been lost during the years of war. He was almost there. After all this time, all the hardship and distance, he was almost home. And with that thought, Leonatus felt a flicker of hope grow stronger in his heart. Despite the fear, despite the unknown, the village still stood before him, waiting for him, like a beacon in the darkness. He tightened his grip on the worn satchel slung across his shoulder, the few belongings he had left rattling softly inside, and took another step forward, his pace quickening, the scent of pine and shelter within reach. As the village neared, Leonatus felt the weight of the past begin to lift, if only slightly. He didn't know what awaited him, but in that moment, under the moon's watchful gaze, he knew one thing for certain: he was almost home, and that was enough to carry him forward. Leonatus finally arrived at the doorstep of his childhood home, the familiar stone cottage standing quietly beneath a blanket of snow. The sight of it, with its thatched roof and smoke curling from the chimney, filled him with an overwhelming flood of emotion. It was as though time had stood still, preserving the house exactly as he remembered it, despite the years of war and chaos that had ravaged the world beyond this small village. The glow of firelight flickered through the windows, casting warm shadows against the frosted panes, and the soft hum of life inside reached his ears like a distant echo of the past. His heart pounded with anticipation, each beat thundering in his chest as he stood before the door he had once so casually passed through every day of his youth. Now, that door felt like the final barrier between him and everything he had longed for during his years of battle. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it, ready to knock. But, suddenly, he hesitated. Doubts, unbidden, flooded his mind. What would he find on the other side of this door? His family, surely. His mother with her warm, welcoming embrace. His father with his deep laughter and proud smile. But what if time had changed them? What if the war had taken its toll on them as it had on him? Would they recognize him, this battle-hardened man with scars both visible and invisible? Or would they see a stranger in their son? And then there was the fear that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. What if they were no longer there at all? His mind raced with questions, swirling in a chaotic torrent. How would he explain all that had happened? The years he had been away, the things he had seen, the comrades he had lost. How could he fit back into a life that had once been so simple, when his soul had been forever altered by the brutality of war? The thoughts weighed on him, freezing him in place. Just as his hand hovered over the door, ready to knock, it suddenly creaked open on its own. The warm light from inside spilled out into the cold night, and Leonatus stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment time seemed to stop. But it was not his mother or father who greeted him. Instead, standing before him in the doorway was a woman whose face, though older and touched by time, stirred memories long buried beneath the weight of battle. Elena. For a moment, he could not move, could not even speak. The sight of her took his breath away. It was as though the years fell away, and he was once again a young man, standing on the threshold of love. Elena, the woman he had left behind when the war called him away, stood before him, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. She was older now, the lines of time faintly etched on her face, but to Leonatus she was just as beautiful as the day he had said goodbye to her. Her dark hair, once free and wild in the wind, was now neatly pinned back, but her eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were the same. In them he saw the love they had shared, a love that had been silenced by years of separation and uncertainty. The memories rushed back in an instant. Stolen moments in the village square, whispered promises beneath the stars, the tearful goodbye before he had left for war, not knowing if he would ever return. Elena stood there, her hand still on the door, her expression frozen between shock and joy. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out at first. Her gaze swept over him, taking in the sight of the man he had become, the hardened features, the scars on his face, the weariness in his posture. But beneath all of that, she saw him, the Leonatus she had loved. The man she had feared was lost forever. Finally, she whispered his name, her voice trembling. Leonatus? The sound of his name on her lips was like a lifeline, pulling him back to the present, grounding him in this moment. He swallowed hard, his own voice thick with emotion. Eleanor. For a heartbeat, they stood there, staring at each other, the weight of all that had passed between them filling the space. Leonatus could see the flicker of disbelief in her eyes, the uncertainty as she tried to reconcile the man before her with the boy she had known. But then, slowly, her expression softened, and something that had been locked away for years broke free. Tears welled in her eyes, glistening in the firelight, but she smiled. A smile that was full of relief, full of love. Without another word, she stepped forward and threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. The warmth of her touch, after so many cold, lonely nights, melted the ice that had settled over his soul during the years of war. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his heart pounding not with fear now, but with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. Hope. The weight of battle, the endless nights of bloodshed and loss, seemed to fall away in that embrace. He had returned, not only to his home, but to her, to the woman he had loved and had thought he might never see again. And as he held her, Leonatus realized that this moment was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that he had never dared to dream would be possible. Elena pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. "I thought you were lost," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I would never see you again." Leonidas shook his head, his own eyes filled with unshed tears. "I'm here," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm home." Elena's voice trembled, her lips barely able to form the name she had once whispered so often in the quiet of her heart. Leonatus. It was as though speaking his name made him real, brought him back from the realm of dreams and memories where she had kept him for so many years. For so long, she had clung to the hope that one day he might return. But as the years dragged on, that hope had slowly faded, replaced by the gnawing fear that he had been lost, consumed by the same war that had claimed so many other souls. Now, seeing him standing before her, alive and real, was almost too much to comprehend. She had imagined this moment countless times in her mind, how he might look, what he might say, how she would react, but none of those fantasies had prepared her for the wave of emotion that crashed over her now. The sight of him, battle-worn and weary, but unmistakably him, caused her heart to race with a mixture of disbelief, joy, and sorrow for all the years they had lost. Leonatus looked different, of course. His once smooth face was now lined with the marks of war, his skin weathered by harsh winters and long marches under the burning sun. There were scars, both visible and hidden, that told stories of battles fought and comrades lost. His eyes, once full of youthful light, were now deeper, shadowed by experiences she could not begin to imagine. But beneath it all, he was still Leonatus, the man she had loved, with a heart so fierce it had sustained her through the darkest nights. Overcome with emotion, Eleanor could no longer hold back. She stepped forward, her hands reaching for him, as though afraid he might disappear if she didn't touch him. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into an embrace so tight it felt as though she were trying to anchor him to this world, to her. The warmth of her touch, after years of only the cold, lonely nights spent in prayer and longing, was like a balm to his soul. It melted away the frozen walls of isolation and despair that had built up within him over years of fighting. The book, or Leonatus, the embrace was overwhelming. He had not been held like this in so long, had forgotten what it felt like to be enveloped in warmth, in love. For so many nights he had huddled under threadbare blankets, listening to the distant sounds of battle, his body numb from cold and his heart even colder. The constant threat of death had hardened him, made him forget the tenderness of human connection. But in Eleanor's arms, he felt something stir within him that he thought had been lost forever. A sense of peace, of belonging, of being home. Her scent was familiar, comforting. The faint fragrance of lavender and pine clung to her, bringing back memories of summer days spent walking through the village woods, her laughter echoing in the breeze. For a moment, Leonatus allowed himself to close his eyes and sink into that memory, into the feeling of being whole again. Elena's embrace was firm, as if she too was afraid to let go, as if releasing him might cause him to vanish like a fleeting dream. She could feel the roughness of his cloak, the coldness of his armor beneath it, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that he was here, in her arms, on this night of all nights. Christmas Eve, the miracle of his return, felt like a divine gift, as if the heavens had granted her the one wish she had whispered in the silence of so many lonely nights. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to let them fall just yet. There would be time for tears later, tears of relief, of joy, and perhaps of sorrow for the time that had been lost. But now, in this moment, all that mattered was that he had come back to her. Against all odds, against the cruel reality of war that had torn so many lovers apart, Leonatus had returned. A voice, thick with emotion, cracked as she whispered, "I thought I had lost you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of waiting, of fearing, of praying for this very moment. I thought the war had taken you, like it has taken so many. Leonatus pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her face. His own eyes, though hardened by the horrors he had seen, softened at the sight of her. He saw the worry lines that hadn't been there before, the signs of sleepless nights and unspoken grief. But he also saw the love in her eyes, the same love that had once made his heart race with excitement, now rekindling the embers of hope within him. "Dear, I'm here," he whispered, his voice rough from years of shouting commands on the battlefield, but now filled with tenderness. "I'm here, Elena." And in that moment a sense of peace washed over him, a peace he had thought he would never feel again. The constant noise of battle, the relentless fear of death, the weight of responsibility for the men who had fallen beside him, all of it seemed to fade away in her embrace. He had been fighting for so long not just with swords and shields, but with his own heart, trying to keep himself from succumbing to despair. But here, in Elena's arms, he could finally let go. He could finally allow himself to believe that the war was behind him, that he had survived not only the physical battles, but the emotional ones as well. The world around them seemed to fade, the cold December night, the snow gently falling. It all became a backdrop to this moment of reunion. Leonatus, a soldier who had seen too much, now felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Peace in the knowledge that he had made it home. Peace in the warmth of Elena's embrace. Peace in the realization that, despite everything, love had endured. Their reunion, though unexpected, felt like the beginning of something new. For Leonatus, it was not just a homecoming to a place, but to a person. A return to the love that had been waiting for him through all the dark, war-torn years. In Elena's arms, he found solace, a soft landing after the storm, and in her eyes he saw a future he had once thought lost forever. And as the snow continued to fall softly around them, the world seemed to hold its breath, honoring the quiet miracle of their reunion on this holy Christmas Eve. As they stood in the warmth of their embrace, the sound of laughter echoed from within the house, a light, melodic sound that stirred something deep in Leonatus's chest. But it wasn't the familiar voices of his parents, the laughter of the home he remembered. No, this was something different, something that didn't fit with the image of the quiet, empty house he had expected to find. It was the carefree, joyful laughter of a child. Confused, Leonatus pulled back slightly, his arms still lingering around Elena's waist as he searched her face. His gaze was questioning, filled with curiosity and a hint of uncertainty. "Who?" he began, his voice rough with emotion, but the words caught in his throat. Elena, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, met his gaze. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the same confusion that had taken root in her heart so many times during the long, lonely years. She swallowed hard, her breath catching in her chest, and, with a trembling hand, she motioned toward the doorway. "Leonatus," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she fought to steady her emotions. "You have a son." The words hit him like a blow. His heart stopped for a moment, his mind scrambling to process what she had just said. A son? He could hardly believe it. The idea seemed too foreign, too unreal. He had left for war, not knowing if he would ever return, certainly not imagining that there would be a child waiting for him. Elena, her hands trembling, reached out to touch his arm, trying to ground him in the truth of what she was telling him. "Before you left," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "I was pregnant. I couldn't tell you, Leonatus. I couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk the hope of you coming back and finding—" Nothing. Her voice broke, and Leonatus, overcome with a mixture of disbelief and awe, stepped closer to her. The reality of her words began to settle in. A son. his son. He had never imagined such a possibility, not in the madness of war, not with everything he had lost and fought for. As Elena wiped away a tear, she gently took his hand and guided him toward the door. There, near the hearth, sat a small boy, no more than 5 years old, playing with a wooden toy. His golden curls caught the flickering light of the fire as he laughed and played, unaware of the momentous arrival that had just taken place. When the boy looked up, his eyes, so like Leonatus's, met his gaze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The child's eyes were wide with curiosity, a mix of innocence and recognition that Leonatus couldn't quite place. And then the child spoke, in a voice soft yet sure, calling out to him, "Father." The word echoed in Leonatus's mind, as if it were a dream, as if his mind couldn't fully grasp it. "Father!" The reality of it hit him like a wave. His heart swelled with emotions he hadn't known existed, a rush of love, of wonder, and of a deep, aching sense of responsibility. He had never thought he would have the chance to be a father, especially after the brutality of war. He slowly kneeled before the boy, his hands trembling as he reached out. The child, shy at first, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Leonatus's voice caught in his throat, but he managed to say, "I'm your father." The boy smiled, a small, tentative smile, and took his hand, and in that moment, the soldier who had walked through the horrors of war, who had left home as a young man, realized that he was no longer the same man. The war had taken so much from him, but in this moment, it had given him something far greater, a family, a future. Leonatus stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend the truth that Elena had just revealed. A son. The words echoed in his ears, their weight pressing down on his chest. He had never even imagined such a possibility, especially not amidst the chaos and violence of war. He had left for battle as a young man, a soldier, with a heart full of uncertainty and fear. Never in his wildest dreams had he thought that the love he left behind would have blossomed into a child, his child. His heart pounded in his chest, the rapid beat drowning out everything else. The world around him seemed to blur as his mind raced, trying to process the gravity of the revelation. A son. A piece of him, born before he left, hidden away in Elena's heart, kept a secret until now. How could he have missed this? How could he have been so far from it, so consumed by war, that he had never known he was leaving behind a legacy? His thoughts were interrupted as Elena, her own eyes filled with tears of joy and longing, gently took his hand and led him toward the warmth of the fire. Her steps were careful, steady, as though she had longed for this moment to arrive, just as much as he had. She led him inside, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of emotions he was feeling. As they entered, Leonatus's gaze fell upon a small boy, no more than 5 years old, sitting near the hearth. The boy was playing with a wooden toy, his small hands moving with a sense of wonder and delight. The flickering firelight danced in the boy's golden curls, casting a warm, ethereal glow around him. For a moment, Leonatus's gaze had stopped, as if time itself had stopped. The boy looked up, his bright, curious eyes locking with Leonatus's. There was a moment of stillness between them, a silence that felt like an eternity. In those wide, innocent eyes, Leonatus saw something that took his breath away. He saw himself, his own reflection in the child's gaze. The same golden curls, the same innocent curiosity, the same unspoken understanding that passed between them in that brief moment. The child's eyes seemed to be asking a question, as if recognizing something in Leonatus that he couldn't yet fully understand. Leonatus's heart twisted with emotion, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than the weight of war. This boy, his son, was a living, breathing testament to the love he had left behind. The war had taken so much from him, but in this child he saw everything he had fought for, everything he had lost, and everything he could never have imagined. A future, a family, a reason to hope again. His voice faltered as he knelt before the boy, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out. The child didn't pull away, instead extending his own small hand in return, their fingers briefly touching. Leonatus's heart swelled with emotion, the magnitude of the moment crashing over him like a wave. "I'm your father," he whispered, his voice thick with the weight of the words. The boy's gaze never wavered, and in that simple exchange, Leonatus knew that he had come home. This child, this precious life, was his redemption. This was the reason he had survived the horrors of war. This child, this family, was his reward. And as the boy smiled, the same innocent smile he had once worn, Leonatus realized that no matter what battles he had fought, no matter how far he had traveled, he had finally found the peace he had been searching for all along. Kneeling before the boy, Leonatus's breath caught in his chest. The sight of the child, so small and innocent, seemed to encompass everything he had fought for and everything he had lost. His emotions swirled within him, a tempest of feelings he had never known, joy that was too vast to contain, fear that gripped his heart at the overwhelming responsibility before him, love so deep it seemed to swallow him whole, and a profound sense of awe that he, a soldier, hardened by war, could now be a father. The boy, with his bright eyes and innocent expression, seemed to sense Leonatus's vulnerability. For a moment, their eyes locked, and in that stillness, the weight of the years between them seemed to vanish. The boy's soft, unsure voice, calling him father in the most tender, uncertain tone. The word hung in the air, a simple, yet earth-shattering revelation that pierced Leonatus's soul. "Father," the boy's voice trembled slightly, as if he wasn't sure how to pronounce the word, but it struck Leonatus with a force that left him breathless. His heart, already overwhelmed with emotion, broke open with an uncontainable joy. In that single word, the years of longing, of separation, of pain and loss, all of it dissolved into something pure, something eternal. He had never imagined hearing that word. Not like this, not in this moment of his return. Leonatus's eyes filled with tears, the kind of tears that come not from sorrow, but from the weight of a love so profound it defied words. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing gently against the boy's face, as if afraid that the moment might slip away, that the reality of it all might shatter like glass. The touch was soft, reverent, as though he was seeing something miraculous, because, in this moment, he was. Tears spilled down his cheeks, unbidden but welcomed, as he touched his son's face for the first time. He could feel the warmth of the boy's skin, the softness of his features, and he realized, in that fleeting moment, how much he had missed in those lost years, how much he had given up, not knowing that this boy existed, that he was a part of him. But now, here he was, this small boy with the same golden curls, the same eyes that reflected his own, the same hope that had burned in his chest for so long. After all the hardship, the years spent in battle, the endless violence and suffering, Leonatus had found his greatest treasure, a family, a future. The wars had taken so much from him, friends, innocence, peace, but they had also brought him here, to this moment, to this boy. He had thought that he was fighting for something abstract, something far off, but now he understood. He had been fighting for this moment of redemption, for this sense of belonging, for this love that no war could ever take away. As the boy reached out, his small hand grasping Leonatus's fingers, the weight of responsibility settled over him like a mantle. It was a burden, yes, but one he would bear with honor. This child, his son, was his future now. And in this child's eyes, Leonatus saw not just the continuation of his bloodline, but the chance to build something greater than anything he had ever fought for on the battlefield. This was his real victory. This was his true homecoming. As the fire crackled and popped in the hearth, sending warmth radiating through the room, Leonatus sat, his eyes transfixed by the dancing flames. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, delicate flakes, blanketing the earth in a pristine white silence. The world seemed still, untouched by the chaos of the past, as if the universe itself had paused to allow him this moment of peace. For the first time in years, he could simply sit and breathe, unburdened by the weight of war, unshackled by the violence and loss that had defined his life for so long. He glanced across the room, his gaze resting on his son, who now sat contentedly near the fire, his small face glowing in the warmth. The boy's innocent laughter echoed through the house, a sound so pure, so filled with joy, that it struck Leonatus to his very core. This laughter, this life, was the gift he had received that night, a gift that transcended everything he had ever known. The wars had taken so much from him. Friends who had fallen beside him in battle, years of his life spent on foreign soil, the quiet peace of home that had seemed so distant during the horrors of war. It had taken his innocence, his sense of security, and the man he had once been. Yet, as the fire's glow illuminated the faces of those he loved, Leonatus realized that, in some inexplicable way, the wars had also given him something he could never have imagined. They had brought him here, to this humble cottage, to this small family that was now his world. He had thought the cost of war was too great, that it had stripped him of everything that mattered, but in this quiet, sacred moment, he understood that it had also led him to something far greater than anything he could have ever dreamed. In the eyes of his son, Leonatus found something he had thought lost forever: hope. It shone in the boy's gaze, a reflection of the love and strength that had endured despite the hardships of the past. Hope for a future filled with possibility. Hope for a life free from the horrors of war. And in Elena's embrace, as she held him close, he found the love that had waited for him all these years, the love that had never wavered, even in his absence. She had kept his memory alive, had protected their son, and now, in this moment, they were whole again. The soldier who had once left for war, leaving behind everything he held dear, had returned to something far more precious than the fleeting victories he had won on the battlefield. He had returned not just to his home, but to a life he never knew he had, one filled with family, with laughter, with joy that ran deeper than any wound the wars had inflicted upon him. He could not erase the past, nor would he ever forget the sacrifices that had been made. But he knew now that there was more to life than the battles he had fought. This Christmas, the greatest gift he had received was not the safety of his own life, nor the peace he had longed for, but the promise of a future he could share with those he loved, a future where the echoes of war could finally fade into the background, replaced by the warmth of family, the beauty of simple moments, and the endless possibilities that lay ahead. And as the snow continued to fall outside, Leonatus knew that, despite the darkness of his past, his future would be filled with the light of love and belonging, something he had never dreamed possible.